I think you're in for a real experience with Howard, applying not technique, not anything that you've heard before, but a time-tested framework that is more relevant than ever. Howard is a psychologist who has also studied neurology, an expert on Jung, archetypal psychology, and author of a wonderful milestone pioneering book, Solar Light, Lunar Light. He's working on a new book about complementarity beyond binary thinking. You'll get a taste of that tonight for sure. He's taught everywhere from the California Institute of Integral Studies to the Esalen Institute and beyond. We try not to hold that against him. But I think Howard has worked with many lights of the psychological practice. He has been a therapist to those who will go nameless in this community and beyond. He's also a businessman. He's done lots of consulting for many Fortune 500 and 100 companies. And tonight, I think it's a real privilege and honor to be able to be in your space, and I'm looking forward to some of the questions that'll probably be bigger than the answers tonight.
Thank you. I do hope the material that we talk about tonight is contagious and that you take it in and let it do its work. You don't have to do the work, but it will do it if you absorb it in, because it's based on the sun and the moon. The physical sun and the moon that's symbolized, and I got really into it when I saw that almost all the alchemy work that Jung did had as the secret sauce the sun and the moon in conjuncto. They were joined together, and particularly the Philosopher's Stone. And many of the myths that most of you are familiar with and have probably acted on as actors and actresses, they've probably been based on some of the myths that don't really say what's below the surface, which is the architecture of light and dark. So acting is actually imitation. Most people think imitation is not the way to learn. I certainly was a dysfunctional student and copied a lot of things and felt guilty, but actually almost all learning comes from copying. It's really about letting go of the conscious ego, which has gotten a bad word. And the ego and the deeper self actually go together. It's the inflated ego or the deflated ego that almost all spiritual traditions talk about getting rid of, not the ego. The ego is the driver of the car, and if your car is working in a purified way without so much of an inflated ego or a wounded ego, you actually are in the flow. So don't buy what's said about the ego yet. Do some experimenting with asking yourself if you're inflated or deflated, and I'll give you a little technique I use to figure that out later. It's letting go of the ego to go on the journey of evolution. And we'll give you a map and a technique. You may use it or not. If it speaks to you, it'll speak to you. It changed my life. So let me share a little bit of that. You might experience feeling disconnected from your craft, technique without presence, fear of the unknown, auditions, new character roles, taking risks, the sense that something is hidden, shadow material that won't come out, or you're afraid something's going to come out of your mouth, or that you're not expecting at that high moment. By the end of today, we'll share an alchemical map, understanding the structure of transformation, a practice that goes with it, and access to the energy that you're carrying in your shadow. Just to give a little history of alchemy, the last part of Jung's, let me read you what Jung said about alchemy. Alchemy was discovered as a device and a turning point in my life at the later stages. The alchemists do not change lead into gold, they change the world into words and images. What Jung discovered, because he'd been trying to figure out why he and Freud had a big breakup after so many years of being close, and they both had different definitions of the unconscious mind. And Jung went off, and this is about 1911, goes off and figures out, goes into a big depression for 4 or 5 years. The First World War comes, and he comes out and he writes a book called Psychological Types, which the Myers-Briggs, which almost everybody knows, is built on. And he starts writing again, starts becoming alive, and had a dream about books in alchemy in Europe. So he bought up all the books that there were mostly in Latin and Greek. His assistant, Marie-Louise von Franz, was a scholar. So they interpreted these books, which were very weird. In 1937, the man who wrote the I Ching that most people are familiar with asked Jung to write about a book called The Secret of the Golden Flower. It was a Chinese alchemy text, and he realized that alchemy was universal. He realized that was the thing that he was missing in his life, and spent from 1937 till the end of his life in the late 50s studying alchemy almost exclusively, because he realized that the alchemists were not making gold, they were making psyche. And to really do the work, you've got to be the fool. And the Fool card, which many of you know about in the tarot deck, is the beginning and the end of the deck. And the Fool is different than being foolish. And most people confuse it and won't show that part of themselves. So who is this fool? You all have known enormous amounts about acting, but this doesn't replace any of that technique, but it adds on to stripping the inflated or deflated ego to give it room to be authentic. So this is not about becoming somebody else, it's about becoming more yourself. The work is to let the fool in you that is usually hidden become available in the service of the character and your wholeness. The Fool is where the power is. The Fool is both the beginning and the end of your journey. So usually we're all alienated to some degree, and I'm sure your parts are alienated at least when you read them the first time. And to do the work that you do as actors is probably the hardest thing to do in the world, because it is an open-ended source of having to be yourself and getting the amount of level of rejection that is really ridiculous, and never getting calls, never getting feedback, putting yourself on the line and never getting feedback. That is an interesting dynamic of an industry, but like most industries are like that. So before we get going into this, there's an architectural structure that Jung talked about, wrote a lot about numbers, 2, 3, and 4. 2 is about relationship, 3 is about transformation, and 4 is a balance of wholeness. 5 is the quintessence where the 4 come to the 1. And by doing this inner work, you can do all 4 of those poles and complete your own journey, and that makes a big difference in your presence, your energy, how people feel you and see you, and will make a difference. So this is the basic structure. Every instinct has something on top of it, and that's the different things we're going to be talking about tonight. So every role comes with 2 alchemical journeys. The character journey, what happens in the script, and the actor's craft journey, what happens inside of you during rehearsal. They're not separate, they're mirrors of each other. And being able to have reflective consciousness rather than narcissistic ego consciousness makes it possible for the 2 to become 1. And that 1 is complementarity, and knowing about complementarity, which is not about opposites, but about how it's both and rather than either or. And to look at the world with both and lens rather than black and white, either or binary thinking changes one's internal experience chemically, visually, emotionally. And these are the 4 alchemical steps. The shadow, admitting your shadow, which is the first step in alchemy. There are 4 colors, black, white, red, and gold. The first step is finding and admitting your shadow. The second step is what all spiritual have, which is a purification process. And you have to purify it inside, many rituals, etc., to do that. The third step is after you purify out, the whitening is called in alchemy, you then start over where you bring the new consciousness spirit back into the character. And that's where the goodies really begins to be rewarded. After you've purified out the shadow, you then start over again, and it's like you're starting over with a cleaner consciousness and without this fragment that we all have inside of ourselves. And the fourth stage, the gold stage, is the integration of the fragment that you're working on into the deeper self. Now, one ego self is a small self, S-E-L-F. The deeper self that combines the conscious and the unconscious mind is called the big self, with a big S-E-L-F rather than a small S-E-L-F. You bring the small ego and the deeper self together, you're in flow, and you have this very different experience. The material from the unconscious comes out with the conscious ego guiding it, rather than it being separate or isolated and you're just doing a rote role. And that's kind of the magic of bringing the conscious and the unconscious together, is really being able to go through your own version. Doesn't have to be this one, but some version of admitting your weakness, your shadow, purifying it out. I'll give you a little technique I use in a bit. And that brings you to the new opportunity to start over. And that's called the reddening, bringing back the blood of energy into your role or your life. And the fourth stage is by practicing that in real time and really not being afraid to address it, you get the gold, which is basically an experience of flow and wholeness. Gold is a metaphor for being whole rather than fragmented. And since we're all been majorly fragmented, I've learned to work backwards to bring the fragment into the wholeness. And I'll share that in a second. So here's the alchemy, call it the prima materia. They spent a lot of time finding the real thing that they worked on. Pre-chemistry, it was in physical items. Post-chemistry, it had to be psychological. So the prima materia for an actor is the script and the personality you bring to it. Then you have to be willing to break the false self out of the ego, and that's the stage that gets you to the self and the soul working together to be purified out in a way that they're in flow and dynamics rather than separate. And the model that I've learned from all the mythology is the twinning model, where if you see this as your twin rather than an object, and I'll give you a current, Kevin, who's a master at AI, truly, we've been talking about AI being your twin, not a problem. And if you see it as your unconscious mind twin, then you have a different relationship going forward as a partner rather than an object. And that twinning consciousness, since everything is born a twin, a very famous Jungian analyst in Los Angeles, Edward Ettinger, which some of you may have come across, said it's necessary to sacrifice the ego to have the twinship. Once you have the twin, you have access to your wholeness. And so if you look at things as a twin relationship rather than objects, it changes the options of how you can interact with it. Please, and then you go to the Rubio, which we've talked about. The character world becomes more one. You move in a more neutral, organic way. You play the subtle, bold, wildly outrageous, integrating yourself into the character. Once you have this twinning, you have a different kind of energy than if it's a fragment in you. And the foundation is more solid. Your personal transformation becomes visible, and this is where the work becomes playful, alive, and generative. And that is a treat of life, to be able to activate that in yourself and not needing another, and to have two people do some of this together makes a very different kind of relationship in life and love than you can have any other way. The completion of the work is you're present and transparent. You and the character are not separate. The character flows through you. You're fully uninhibited to be authentic, conscious of the emergence of you in the role, fully alive, fully present. This is presence. This is actually the Philosopher's Stone. Kevin asked me to look at a book called Complexity that just come out. And I said, why do I want to look at complexity when it only takes 4 steps? And I kind of laughed at that, and we kind of laughed, or we're still laughing or not laughing. But the truth is, to really do this work, it is hard. But however, it's only a few steps. And if you start doing it and you feel like the steps work, it gives you a roadmap for life, personal and professional, that is very unique and very different. And it's free to everybody. Absolutely free, no charge. You can do it yourself. It's harder, like everything you do yourself. And there's a whole other level of presence with another that is part of any role or any part of life. And if you can get a partner, you can do it. You don't need a partner. You can do it yourself. If you get somebody with you that does some of it, you'll experience a different kind of relationship right away.